Welcome everyone to today's webinar. We're really excited to be here today to share with you the work on the new ACLCA PCR Guidance, Process and Methods Toolkit. I'm Terry Swack and I'm the founder and CEO of Sustainable Minds, and I'm here today with my colleagues Amlan Mukherjee, Heather Dilla, and special guest Migdalia Carrion from the Federal Highway Administration. For those of you who are attending, I'm assuming that you all are on the same page about you've seen the increase in demand for EPDs to communicate the environmental impacts of products and processes. And as we were working on this guidance, we knew that there was regulation already happening and coming down the road, both from states and from the federal government. And so we couldn't really be more excited about being here today, the day after the Inflation Reduction Act has been signed into law, and it's all systems go as far as the industry is concerned. We're ready, and we recognize that not only is there a critical need to use EPDs, but that EPDs need to be better. They need to be clearly standards conformant. They need to be consistent with life cycle assessment best practices, and they need to be digital. Really gone are the days where any other industry is going to print first and then digital. And today EPDs aren't even digital. They're still all print. So part of this whole process of upgrading EPDs completes itself with how we publish them, and we'll touch on that at the end. So it was extremely urgent that the industry, the LCA practitioners, who are the ones who deliver the process and tools for creating LCRs and EPDs, really get together to create reliable technical frameworks to support these protocols industry-wide, and ultimately assuring the quality of PCRs, ensure the quality of the EPD results that can therefore then reliably inform decision-making. So today our agenda is going to be, we're going to hear from Migdalia to talk about the motivation, what's happening in government initiatives, and particularly specifically at FHWA. Heather is going to talk about the evolution in demand for EPDs, starting with LEED version 4 back in 2012. Amlan is going to talk about the technical solution, what's been developed, and I'm going to give you a demonstration of the tools in the toolkit, how they get used. And really importantly, one of the primary purposes of this webinar is to engage the community, the industry, you who are here, in participating in the user group to carry this work out into the marketplace and continue the evolution and the implementation. So this webinar is being recorded. You will get sent the recording. You can request a PDF of the deck if you like. In the follow-up, when you get the recording, you'll get the link again to the PCR guidance on the ACLCA site. And any questions that we don't answer in today's session, you'll definitely get answered in follow-up. And finally, as you leave, we've set up just a couple exit questions that allow you to let us know if you would like to participate in the user group and what your role is in this process. We all would really appreciate if you would just take the extra 30 seconds to leave that information on your way out. All right, I'm going to turn things over to Migdalia and take it away.
Thank you so much, Terry. Good afternoon and good morning, everyone. As Terry mentioned, my name is Migdalia Carrion. I am Federal Highway Sustainable Pavements Program Manager, and for me it's an honor to be today presenting to all of you the great work that has been done throughout the years and talk about the motivations and why the work that we will be presenting today in this webinar is so important for the work ahead that we have. So with that, if you can, Terry, next slide. A disclaimer, this is a part of our required slide from our lawyers. Everything that I will be discussing today is not required by law. Next. That's an acronym slide. Again, standard. I will make sure that I spell everything as I move forward. So next one. With that, as most of you know, transportation agencies have a key role, and public entities that work in the infrastructure world as a whole have a key role in ensuring the embodied carbon emissions, how we reduce that component of our greenhouse gases emissions. When we look at the life cycle of pavement system here, I'm focusing on pavement system as is, you know, where the sustainable pavement program is all about. It is greater than the 29% shown by EPA in this graph. This, I think, is back 2018. When we look at the other components that are accounting for the embodied emissions, we can see in the graph that the transportation industry tailpipe, that's the 29%. But when we are looking at the other industry, if we look at the industry, at the electricity, all of those are components that are contributing to that embodied emissions that we can see through the constructions projects as we work on it, and that material component is key for us to work to reduce the quantification of transportation greenhouse gas emissions. Furthermore, transportation agencies influence the pavement design, the material selection, material and construction specifications, and all of those is done directly towards that embodied carbon emission. As such, public agencies are looking to inform their decision-making process with reporting tools that allow them, and that's how we get to EPDs. So why, you know, public agencies and private sector have turned, you know, the way to EPDs is because they are reporting tools that communicate the environmental impact in a standardized, transparent, and third-party verified way. But we all know that EPDs, as we are moving forward to inform our decision makings, there are the needs to more harmonized approaches. And as we move to communicate the impact on the environmental impact associated with the production of construction materials, it is needed for us to work on the reporting of EPDs. And now that we are having at the state and federal level, next slide, not only at the federal level, but also at the state level, we are seeing that more and more we are having states getting with the bike lane policy, what we are calling bike lane policies. Here on the map, I wanted just to depict some of the states that have been early adopters and are moving towards having legislation that has passed for the bike lane policies. You can see on the pink color, California, Colorado, Oregon, and on the blue color, you can see other states that are considering or have considered in the past to pass bike lane policies. And some of these bike lane policies are calling out the use of EPDs, others not necessarily, but as we are seeing the trend, we are seeing that more and more, not only at the state, but also at the local level, are moving towards implementing bike lane policies, and not necessarily through a mandate through the state legislation, but also as agencies are moving toward understanding and doing their part. Next slide. At the federal level, last year, Biden-Harris administration signed the executive order, the 14057, It has been most of the significant ones, even though we all know that we recently have the passing of the Inflation Act, and even though at the moment it's going through the Biden desk for his signature, we will be able to talk more once our lawyers at here Federal Highway and other federal agencies make the interpretations to moving towards implementing that bill, which it will become law very soon. On the executive order, I wanted to mention that there, the administration has set some national goal, where those goals to achieve net zero emissions through the federal procurement, leveraging the procurement at the federal level to go and recommend some bike lane policies to promote the use of construction material with lower embodied emissions. Throughout this executive order, there was a bike lane task force created and a technical advisory committee in which agencies such as GSA, EPA, USDA, DOD, DOE, and DOT, including Federal Highway, are part of, and members such as myself and others have been meeting weekly to where we have been working for recommendations on how to implement at the federal agencies some of these goals that has been set in the executive order. Here, I just wanted to point out that if you go and read section 303 on the executive order, it does give you key information on what the task force is set to do. It needs to consider embodied emissions and pollutants of construction material in the federal procurement, and it will, identify and prioritize materials to use, and also providing recommendations to increase the transparency of embodied emissions, including supplier reporting, and it even goes to a call for environmental product declarations. So that's a key component of why, all this work that we are doing is key for us to implement and successfully use EPDs to inform our decision making. As you can see, from the EO and other state legislation, they are calling for the use of EPDs in procurement process. However, there is still significant work to ensure PCRs are harmonized, and thus ensuring EPDs used for procurement meet the standards of public procurement needed for successful use of EPDs. That's where the work that we are presenting today fits in and is crucial. Today, you will hear from the authors of this work, or some of the authors of this work, what they are calling the ECLCA PCR guidance and how to use it in a way that the users and the public agencies can start calling for the use of this toolkit to get more harmonized EPDs to where we can use it in a way that it will be used in the procurement. To that, more than 2 years ago, Federal Highway contracted Michigan Tech, Dr. Amlan Mukherjee, and we will have him today, and he will explain, as well as Dr. Heather Dilla, about what has been that process and that history of how we got here today. So with that, I will hand it back to you, Terry.
Thank you, Migdalia. Let's move right on into Heather. Let's talk about what's happening today.
Sure, and to get started, we're going to talk about the biggest news of the day, the Inflation Reduction Act. There is significant amounts of funds being devoted on supporting EPDs used in procurement and increasing the transparency and standardization of EPDs. So just to give you a flavor, there's $100 million going to EPA. Sorry, I'm going to start with the $250 million going to EPA, and that $250 million is to support the development and enhanced standardization and transparency and reporting of EPDs. In addition, they're going to have EPA gets another additional $100 million to start classifying what are going to be considered quote unquote low carbon materials using EPDs. So they must base their low carbon materials based on EPDs in general, And then they have $2 billion in grants to FHWA for projects that use EPDs, or $2.19 billion for GSA that similarly uses products that have that are considered low carbon by use of EPDs. So moving forward, next slide, Terry. It's important to note that the EPDs have evolved over time, and so this use of EPDs in public procurement was not actually when the first thought of the use of EPDs. And initially in 2012, EPDs were being requested from USGBC's the Green Rating System, LEED. They removed a lot of their material credits that would give you credits for recycled content and material use, construction materials, and replaced it with the transparency credits, which required and requested EPDs. In 2013, ACLCA recognized that there was a need for more clarity and to increase the legitimacy of the EPDs for providing some guidance. So they released their first PCR guidance in 2013, and that was a broader stakeholder effort that worked on that guidance. From there, in 2017, EPDs were being requested first in California by BuyClean for procurement. So you can see that over the years that it has evolved, and not necessarily the ISO standards haven't evolved with that. And because of that, FHWA, as you heard from Migdalia, they worked on a project to look at PCR guidance. And that PCR guidance project looked back at ACLCA's first PCR guidance, but was also looking at it from a public procurement's perspective. And is it consistent and fair? Are we getting reliable results, and are they truly comparable? And with that project, it resulted in the fact that no, there does need to be further standardization in order for EPDs to be used in procurement. But not only that, with time, we realized that EPDs are also a building block or a data source for broader LCAs and other decision making. And so this use of EPDs for where we started with just transparency, you know, as a company could transparently communicate their environmental stewardship, has merged to making procurement decisions to now even broader of using it as a data source into LCA. And each one of these components require different level of standardization and technical requirements in order for you to be sure that you're making good decisions. With that, FHWA merged and worked with ACLCA, and there was an ACLCA EPD comparability working group working on some guidance as well, and the toolkit resulted out of the efforts of all these ongoing improvements. Next slide. So if you were to look at the uses or what needs to be aligned, the broadest use of EPDs is the transparency and communication tool. So, you know, all EPDs can be used at that level for that communication tool, but if you want to actually get to comparability, there are certain technical requirements that need to come in play, and comparability comes into play for that procurement aid. One of them is, are you prescribing your background data sets? Is everybody using the same? Because if somebody's using one data set and another one's using a different one, they're no longer comparable. Then if you're going up to the highest level, it's data source, and that can you use EPDs into a broader LCA, then you're going to need harmonization. And here's where you're actually looking at not just my product sector, is it harmonized with another product sector, and we making consistent decisions amongst our PCRs. And so this toolkit is arranged to help communicate what are those technical requirements, you know, that need to be met for each of these use cases, but also to communicate what PCRs and EPDs are meeting each requirement, and how can therefore the user use the EPD properly. So that's the whole idea of the toolkit that you'll hear about today. Next slide. One of the challenges that was noted is that, you know, if you were to look at an EPD, there's plenty of information on the EPD, but it doesn't clearly communicate to a user, if I'm a specifier, whether or not I can use this EPD in an LCA, or is it really a good EPD for procurement? And again, just the whole idea of this toolkit is to identify which criteria are really essential for each of these use cases, but then also to communicate to users that are looking at EPDs, what is the proper use of that EPD. So those EPD programs that do use this toolkit would clearly identify on the EPD what is the particular use case of the EPD moving forward. So with that, I think we're going to go to the next slide and turn it over to Dr. Aman Mukherjee, and he's going to describe the process of how we came up with the toolkit. You're muted. You're muted, Aman.
Of course. Thank you very much, Heather. Good afternoon, everybody. And as Migdalia earlier said, I'm Professor Michigan Tech, and we had contracted with FHWA to develop a guideline for PCR development for pavement and construction materials. And then, of course, then after that was done, we worked with Terry and other a committee within ACLCA to see how this could be generalized for PCRs across different industries. And then Heather just gave you a little bit of a history of how we got here, why we needed to do this. And so what does this toolkit look like? To understand what the toolkit comprises of, it's a good idea to hark back to what Heather was just talking about. There is a lot of information that is communicated through an EPD. And to be clear, it is important to understand that underlying that information are decisions that are made by multiple decision makers. Terry, the next click, please. So first and foremost, there is the program operator, right? The program operator decides the program implementation plan, right? And after that, after that, we have the PCR committee, right? The PCR committee decides the LCA framework, the models and assumptions that support the program, the product category rule, the PCR. This is a very important committee because there is the representativeness on this committee of stakeholders for the product, as well as with other allied upstream and downstream products, becomes very, very crucial to making decisions that go to the heart of the validity of the PCR. What kind of data sets are to be used? Is the PCR prescriptive in terms of background data sets that it selects? So there is a lot of decision making, very technical and critical decision making that happens by the PCR committee. Same, and then after that comes the reviewers. As you're familiar probably with there are multiple levels of review that the process goes through. There is the review of the PCR, there is the public comment period, then there is accounting for all the comments that come in through the public comment period. Then there is also the review of the EPD that is developed and the review of that EPD, whether it's for its compliance with PCR. And all of this happens within the regime of various ISO standards, 21930, 14025 being the two standards that we very often refer to. Next click. All of this means that there are multiple decision makers who are making these decisions. They're coming from various different sectors of the industry and various different and often other industries and sometimes even competing industries. So there has to be consistency in how the program operator sets this process and lays it all out. Next, there has to be comparability, right? I mentioned data sets, how the PCR is prescriptive about upstream data sets, data collection protocols. If these are not laid out properly, then comparability of, and again, there is a big discussion on comparability of EPDs, and that's not within the scope of this particular webinar, but using the EPDs in decision making and being able to take those numbers and verify them within the context of use, and that's what I mean by comparability here, that also becomes a critical and important point. And then finally, for reviewers, the review process, given the review schedule that ISO sets out, the review process is what leads to the reliability of the underlying information that is communicated. All of these three have to be done within some specific rubric and with guidance that really spans across multiple industries, multiple products. And that was, that was what led to the development of the guidance toolkit. And what we did was we said, well, why don't we just organize the toolkit around these three roles? So the roles of the program operator, the roles of the PCR committee, and the roles of the reviewer, and then create guidance that each one of these roles would have to fulfill, and really use it as a checklist to go through. Now, there is, as we go to the next slide, there has been some discussion on Well, so what is this guidance toolkit? Is it going to be held as a regulatory tool? Will be actually the way of, and speaking very honestly about this, the way we started off with this, with the development of this toolkit and the original motivation, and still very much, is to really help program operators, PCR committees, reviewers do a better job and really provide them with a resource that makes their lives a lot simpler. Why? Because there are multiple, as I pointed out, multiple ISO standards that typical PCR and then EPDs has to be conformant with, right? So this is really a resource. So what does the resource entail? Next, so underlying it, there are, I would say there are two components to this toolkit. The first part is what I refer to as the aspects of the toolkit that help program operators, PCR committees, reviewers develop better and more conformance with ISO 21930, right? So standards conformance, we provide you with a checklist by criteria, classified by role, I pointed out, for each of those 3 roles. So that means that if you're, and the toolkit is developed in such a way that if you just follow the checklists and criteria that are specific to your role, you'll be good to go because it'll be consistent with the other roles as well. And then we try to make it user-friendly so it's easy to use. Of course, and I spoke about the classification by roles. And then the next thing is levels of conformance. There are program operators that have different reasons why they're coming up with a EPD program. And as it turns out, EPDs, you can have a valid conformant EPD that provides communication, and then but is probably not good enough for, and when I say good enough, I mean not at the level where it can be used for procurement. And then there are other ones that are, of course, at a level where the EPD itself can be used as a building block, as a data source. And that's so we thought of developing these 3 levels of good, better, best, so to say, in terms of the criteria that are being met within the guideline toolkit. And then also each of this is also, again, helps you get that guidance to get to those levels. So at the first level is transparency, where we meet 42 criteria, and then after that, if you meet an additional 22 criteria, you have an EPD, or you have a PCR that can lead to, that can support an EPD that is ready for procurement use. And as Heather pointed out, public procurement was one of the motivators to this work. And then finally, if you meet 4 additional criteria on top of that, you have an EPD that can be used as a data source, as a building block. The second part of this EPD is what we are thinking of, the methods and the methodology addenda, right? So if you think about everything that's on top of that line, this is more process oriented. It's the process of creating the PCR, developing EPD, all the conformance issues around the ISO standards. And the second one, what we have, the second part is the methods and methodology, is like going into more very specific technical discussion topics, right? So one of them is like allocating burdens and benefits of materials shared across product systems, secondary materials, for example, recycled materials, right? And so what we're doing is, again, this toolkit is an evolving effort. And so at this time, we have 2 methodology related addenda that have already been developed and are available for use. And what they do is they give you guidance on how to address issues of allocating or questions around allocating secondary materials in your LCA. So second one is assessing data quality of background lifecycle inventory data sets. Right now, this we've established what we refer to as a data quality pedigree matrix, which is an extended version of the pedigree matrix that was developed by EPA. And so now that is available and ready for use. And of course, within the context of the US market, we have identified some background lifecycle inventories through the Federal LCA Commons that can be used. And of course, it's not a requirement, but it is a strongly recommended prescription that PCR committees can adopt, and thereby really take their PCRs to a point that is more standardized and can be used across different domains. There is more coming. So one that we are working on right now is looking at biogenic carbon and how biogenic carbon is to be accounted for in the underlying LCAs and reported in the EPDs. And with that, the checklist, what does the checklist look like? Thank you, Terry. So this is a very high-level glimpse of what the checklist looks like, and Terry will take you more into details on how this use cases of this particular guideline. So the next click, you will see that on the right-hand side, the central column is where you have the criteria that is to be met for a particular, in this case, is the PCR committee role. And so for that criteria, you will see that when you meet that criteria, it tells you what ISO clauses, what clauses in the ISO the standards you're also meeting by meeting that criteria. And this is kind of important to highlight, because oftentimes what happens is that a particular decision or a particular action can affect multiple clauses in the ISO guideline. And so in this case, by putting it together in this format, we're really providing a resource to PCR committees in this case to go and use this as a checklist and say, hey, we've taken care of this, which means we've automatically taken care of 14025 clause 5.5 and 14027 clauses 5.2 and 6.4.4. And this is where this becomes a real advantage and a handy toolkit to use. The next click, and then also as soon as you're checking off one of those criteria, whether it's 1 or 2 or 3, you know what ISO clauses you're fulfilling. You're also finding out which of the criteria you can check off towards the transparency criteria, the procurement criteria. And with that, I'm going to pass it on to Terry to give us an example of how these roles play out and how these use cases are defined. Thank you, Terry.
Well, thank you, Amlan and Heather. And we didn't really do a round of introductions at the start of this webinar. So just to recap on that just a little bit, why are we, this group of people, giving this presentation? In a previous version, Amlan had a timeline of how this work evolved. And just so that you know, this package, this toolkit, has been in development for 2 years. But prior to that, FHWA funded research that Amlan and a group of excellent LCA practitioners led to determine how to evaluate current PCRs to determine if they're going to create EPDs that provide reliable results. And so the early research funded by FHWA resulted in a paper and an early checklist of things you should look for to make sure that a PCR is delivering EPDs with reliable results. Then Amlan came to the ACLCA, to the PCR committee, where I was running a working group on EPD comparability. Why aren't EPDs comparable was the research topic we were looking at, and looking at the history of EPDs. And, all roads lead back to the PCR. The reason EPDs aren't comparable, meaning they're just not the same. Not are the results comparable, but they're just all different in so many ways. But why? And it all comes back to the PCR, because it's the PCR that stipulates what's in the EPD. So we decided to just take on both things in the same working group. So Amlan and I, for 2 years, have led this working group with a team of authors and volunteers, probably 20 to 30 people. And this was, you'll see, an incredible amount of work. And Heather joined the process. She'd also been at FHWA. She joined in to help move the work forward. So this is ongoing work happening under the umbrella of the PCR committee at the ACLCA, but this PCR guidance working group will continue to be responsible for the development of the framework, as well as the publication of the addenda. And the user group that we're forming, that I'm inviting all of you to sign up to have a hand in, will be the group that brings this to market, communicates about it, creates demand for it, and becomes expert at its implementation. So, we've, if you take the software analogy, we've been in development for a long time. We did an alpha, we did a beta. This has had several rounds of public comment. And so now it's in version 1, where we want to get program operators to start using it, but also it is now available as a toolkit with the same intent that FHWA had looked into originally, which is all the PCRs that are out there, and particularly ones that state and federal governments are relying on for Buy Clean and other buying public procurement programs. They're relying on the EPDs from those PCRs. Now is a great time to get started evaluating those PCRs to identify what needs to happen in an update, or if there's a PCR that's going to be required, to identify how the required PCR is different from any that exist, and that the program operator who takes on that task of creating that PCR will create it in conformance with the toolkit. So just picking up where Amlan left off, and Amber had and Heather had introduced this level of use cases. And so today, all of the EPDs that get created have been created for the purpose of transparency. There hasn't been this explicit intent to create EPDs for any other purpose other than transparency. But as we created more criteria, we realized that with these new demands for public and private procurement, as well as supply chain data, being able to take high quality supply chain data to use it as an input into an EPD, that there is more rigor required for the results of the EPD to be reliable. And so rather than requiring that every single PCR have every single rigorous requirement baked in, the idea is that the PCR committee would decide at the beginning which use case is going to be right for the products for their industry that the PCR is being created for. Is the industry looking for transparency? And we're not talking about, just transparency. We're talking about really good transparency, standardized transparency. Or, is it a product category that is now being identified in public procurement or even private procurement policies? Or are we talking about a data source that would be used in other EPDs? And so it's right at the beginning that the committee and program operator decide the level of EPD. The PCR could be created to do all 3 levels. It's also an option, which would simply mean that they would have to meet all the criteria, and the user, the manufacturer, can then choose which level they'd like to create it to. So now we've got some flexibility, but there's still rules around how to make EPDs that are going to be good quality, reliable at each of these levels. What we also did was we thought about, well, how is this going to get implemented? Because early on, there was the idea, well, should there be an external group that oversees the outcome of the PCR, like an external verifier that awards conformance to the PCR? And then we realized, like, what are we talking about? We don't need to add another layer of bureaucracy. And that's what the PCR verifiers do. That's their job, is to verify that the PCR is conformant with all the ISO standards that it needs to be conformant with. So what we did was just said, look, the folks doing PCR verification, their job just got a little bit larger, but let's make this toolkit a toolkit where the process is baked in, so that the PCR verifiers at the end get everything they're looking for, and it's all organized. So the toolkit, as Amlan had described, is a checklist for each role: program operator, PCR committee, and the review panel. They're all set up, organized by kind of phase of the process for the role, the checklist criteria, the ISO reference, the deliverable, and the EPD use case that criteria is for. But what I was showing you here on this slide is that these use cases are cumulative. So there's 27 criteria to create a transparent EPD. There's 20 more for EPD can be used for public procurement. And then there's 3 more. So to create a PCR that creates EPDs that can be used as a data source, there's 50 criteria that need to be met. And so keeping track of the deliverables, at the end of the day, it all is going to end up in the hands of the review panel so they can actually make sure that each of the criteria was met. So what you see, and this is an old version of this slide, but any place, so this should have been red, but any place where the criteria is part of the process of the guidance, it's red, and it says this guidance and the supporting documentation is the completed checklist in this case. So if you take all of the red criteria, so all of the process for implementing the guidance, every role is involved in the process for implementing the guidance. And again, ending up with ensuring, so this is written just like any other technical standard with shalls and shoulds. We've bolded what's a shall, also what's a should. Yeah, but at the end, the PCR review panel shall use this checklist to guide their process of reviewing the PCR, and the supporting documentation is their completed checklist, and they're going to get the completed checklist from each of the other roles. So how will we identify PCRs and EPDs that are created to be conformant with the guidance? So notice this is 2 shall statements that the program operator shall include a statement adjacent to the name of the PCR to indicate that it's conformant with the guidance. And additionally, when an EPD is published and verified, then it clearly should indicate that the EPD was created from a PCR that's conformant with the guidance. Now, maybe at some point in time, and this is something that the user group would help, create more formality around how these documents get labeled. For now, we're saying there's not a standardized emblem, there's not, a logo. There's, this is going to be up to the program operators to, if they are turning their programs into conformant programs, this simply becomes part of the way they create PCRs and publish EPDs. Another thing that Sustainable Minds is going to do is several years ago, we created this product category rule catalog for the North American building and construction industry. It lives in the transparency catalog. It's free. There's no login. And we keep it up to date every month. We keep track of PCRs that are either in development or under revision. We track so it's organized by master format. It indicates who the program operator is. Here's the name. This will link to the actual PCR, or in the case of UL, it will link to the page that allows you to sign up to get the PCR, but all the other program operators will let you download without that process. It has the validity period. We identify EPDs that have PCRs that have expired. And so what we'll be doing probably in the next 6 months as this guidance begins to take root in the marketplace, is we will add a column to this table to indicate whether the PCR has been created in conformance with the guidance. The last piece I want to talk about, and this is also part of the guidance, it's one of the program operator checklist criteria, is to start to create pathways to publishing digital EPDs and to think about going digital concurrent with publishing the standard PDF. OpenEPD is a program from Building Transparency, the folks that have brought us the EC3 tool. And it's largely populated. It's a global database of EPDs that have been digitized. But again, the point is that people have the need to be able to use this data in all kinds of tools. So, and we've also learned that trying to use machine readers to extract data from EPDs is not a high quality way of capturing data, and particularly because all EPDs are different in their format as well as in their creation. It's really problematic. So there's going to be more on OpenEPD and digitization. And there's even frameworks in OpenEPD to take the requirements from PCRs to make PCR specific fields available in EPD templates, so that when the LCA provider has finished the LCA, that provider and or the program operator can then go populate the template in OpenEPD, which has been created in accordance with the PCR. So to recap, what's in this toolkit? The core guidance is the 3 process tabs for program operator, the PCR committee, and the PCR review panel. So again, that's all about the process. So we separated how PCRs get made from the detailed methodologies and methods for calculating. And this is the first set of 8 topics that have been identified. As Amlan mentioned, there are several more already in development. This disclaimer and the digital EPD methodology addenda should be published in the next month or 2. And again, the role of the user group is to start using the toolkit, evaluating the checklist, trying them out, evaluating existing PCRs. If you are a trade organization who has sponsored a PCR and it's coming up for review, now would be a great time to have the program operator use the toolkit to evaluate the PCR for themselves, to show you, the purchaser of the PCR or the head of the PCR committee, what needs to be focused on. Additionally, you could ask a third party to do that review, to provide back to the program operator. And so part of the user group will be to create a roster of third-party reviewers who will take on the process of evaluating existing PCRs to highlight what needs to happen in those updates. So, you know, we want to be able to look at what exists today. We don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. How can we improve what exists today, and how do we have new ones getting started, you know, get done in the highest quality way possible. So the next steps coming out of this webinar, again, is to, as you leave, just tell us a little bit about yourself and let us know if you either want to get involved or at least be on the mailing list to stay apprised of the progress. Again, speak to the program operators that you work with to create PCRs that are conformant with the toolkit. Be sure to think about that use case level when you're considering your how to create the PCR. And then for those of you who are specifiers and people who make decisions about products using EPDs, you need to start asking manufacturers and program operators, hey, we want EPDs that have been made from conformant PCRs. What's happening in your industry about that? And I guarantee you, most manufacturers, at least for the first year, are going to be like, what are you talking about? So we're going to work hard through the ACLCA and through the user group to try to educate the marketplace about what this is. But that's why it requires all the participants to get involved and communicate and create demand if we are really going to, at the end of the day, make decisions based on better data to make and use lower impact materials and products. So again, when you leave the webinar, leave your info, you can go to the ACLCA website, the PCR page, anytime to download the toolkit and anytime sign up for the mailing list. And that's what we've got for you guys today. We'll take a look at some of the questions, but Amlan and Heather, they actually spent a little time thinking about how a program operator might add the labeling to their EPD to begin to tell this story. Amlan or Heather, would you like to add anything to what you have on this slide here?
Of course. Well, I mean, this is a little illustration we prepared the last time we were presenting, and the idea is that in many ways we could start looking at this guideline and this toolkit as a way to improve your EPDs, PCRs, and as a resource. But also on the other end, on the front end as a resource, but on the once a PCR is out there, you can also look at the ways in which you can think of it as rating your PCR as a transparency or as procurement, as a data source. And what you're really doing is you're using this toolkit as a way to communicate to whoever is using your EPD, the reliability, the level at which you're communicating that information. So the quality, the reliability, all that, right?
There are two technical questions that came in that I'm going to throw out to you. So the first question is, it looks as though the toolkit only references EN 1508 2021, and the new plus A2 is in effect July of this year. Yeah, there's a correction. Will this take into account EN 15804 plus A2?
I think so this is okay, that's a good question. So this is primarily looking at the emphasis is on ISO 14025 21930. 15804 has been in some places has been referenced as well, but the primary emphasis has definitely been on the ISO standards. And for that matter, again, from a EN 15204 that standard and that regime, much of what happens with 21930, there are some differences, but a lot of it follows through pretty well.
There's another question, and the questioner is asking about a recent study about how PVC luxury vinyl tile flooring EPDs use old data and are not accurate for the embodied carbon and environmental damage of PVC. Will their concerns be addressed? So, Amlan, how will an update to the flooring PCR using this framework, how might that help address this question about old data?
Right, absolutely. And I think the first, so that's actually a great question and a wonderful use case example, because what would happen is that as the PCR for this particular product is being updated, it would behoove the PCR committee to go back to this toolkit and say what aspects of this toolkit is the current PCR meeting, and what aspects of this toolkit, what criteria need to be met for it to reach one of these levels: transparency, procurement, or data source. And you will very quickly find that one of the requirements for PCR is to have an underlying LCA. And then you look at the underlying LCA and you look at the validity of the underlying LCA. When was it done last time? And right there, in the toolkit is going to take you through data quality requirements, and the PCR committee will quickly recognize which criteria they need to fulfill at this point to update the PCR. So this is just, I'm just looking at this purely from a process point of view. So if you just use the toolkit and just follow the process and see and keep checking off all of those, as a matter of following the process, what you'll end up doing is you will end up updating your data sources, because it is likely, and in this case clearly we're recognizing that the data sources are outdated. It is very likely that means that they're not meeting the ISO standards as required, and that also in effect that right there is an opportunity for updating that PCR. And as you update that PCR, you can update each of those data sources as well as the underlying LCA. And yeah, that's how you would use the toolkit. Thank you, that was a great question. So one of the goals is that if you just follow the process in the toolkit, you will also end up taking care of the technical issues. And just another question on 15804, the last question to readdress that. As Terry pointed out, there is and she's got this slide right up there, the guidance user groups. So we don't see this as the set in stone final document. Here we go. I think ISO standards get updated. EN 15804 gets updated. There are some small but important differences between 15804 and 21930. And so this document, this process, this toolkit is an ongoing, continuing process. And we've started this off, and over time, we want this to be a representative community. We want this to be a user group or a community that reflects the concerns of the users. So this is a great opportunity to get involved with the user group.
And let me put a finer point on that. That is the point exactly of the user group. This is version 1.0. And so we feel like, we've covered a lot of issues and a lot of use cases in the 2 years we've been working on this. But now when you put something into the marketplace and people start using it, and you really get, hive brain even more than we had, these kinds of things are going to come up. And so what comes up for the user group will be funneled back to the working group, who will maintain and update the framework. And when there are enough updates that make it sensible to push a new release, then that'll happen. So there were a couple of follow-up questions. The attendee who asked about the flooring PCR and the inaccurate data. Yeah, the manufacturers who are in the PCR committee do decide what data sets get used, but it is the responsibility of the program operator to make sure they go through all the criteria in the checklist to meet the requirements, and ultimately for the verifiers to determine that as well.
Correct.
So there are a lot of kind of criteria that require people to do a deep dive on things that they had never done in the past because program operators weren't requiring it. Therefore, there will be more technical work that will need to be done by the PCR committee to make these decisions, which should result in better choices and a better PCR. So looks like we're just past our time, and I'm going to say thank you to the presenters, Heather, Amlan, Migdalia. Thank you to everyone who came and listened, and to those of you who will join us in taking this out into the marketplace and getting things done. So thank you all, and have a great day. Thanks, Amlan.
Thank you, Terry. Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.